Manor Farm, was drunk.
He lurched across the yard, kicked off his boots at the back door, drew himself a last glass of beer from the barrel in the scullery, and made his way up to bed.
As soon as the light went out, there was a stirring and a fluttering all through the farm buildings.
Word had gone round that old Major, the prize boar, had had a strange dream and wished to communicate it to the other animals as soon as Mr. Jones was safely out of the way.
Old Major was so highly regarded that everyone was quite ready to lose an hour's sleep in order to hear what he had to say.
First came the dogs, then the pigs, who settled down in the straw immediately in front of the platform.
The hens perched themselves on the windowsills. The pigeons fluttered up to the rafters. The sheep and cows lay down behind the pigs and began to chew the cud.
The two cart horses, Boxer and Clover, came in together, setting down their vast hairy hooves with great care, lest there should be some small animal concealed in the straw.
Clover was a stout, motherly mare who had never quite got her figure back after her fourth foal.
Boxer was an enormous beast, nearly 18 hands high, as strong as any two ordinary horses put together. He was not of first-rate intelligence, but he was universally respected for his steadiness of character and tremendous powers of work.
After the horses came Muriel, the goat, and Benjamin, the donkey. Benjamin was the oldest animal on the farm, and the worst-tempered. He seldom talked, and when he did, it was usually to make some cynical remark such as,
God gave me a tail to keep the flies off, but I'd rather have no tail and no flies.
At the last moment, Molly, the foolish, pretty white mare who drew Mr. Jones's trap, came mincing daintily in, flirting her mane to draw attention to the red ribbons it was plated with.
All the animals now being present, Major cleared his throat and began.
Comrades, you have heard about the strange dream I had last night. But I have something else I wish to talk to you about first. I do not think, comrades, I shall be with you very much longer. And before I die, I feel it my duty to pass on to you such wisdom as I have acquired. I have lived a long life, and I think I understand the nature of life on this earth as well as any animal now living. It is about this I wish to speak to you. Comrades, what is the nature of this life of ours? Let's face it, our lives are miserable, laborious, and short. We are worked to the last atom of our strength, are given just so much food as to keep breath in our bodies, and as soon as our usefulness has come to an end, we are slaughtered with hideous cruelty.
Isn't this simply part of the order of nature?
Is this because the land is so poor? No, comrades, 1,000 times no. This farm of ours could support a dozen horses, 20 cows, hundreds of sheep in a comfort and dignity almost beyond our imagining.
Then why do we continue in this miserable condition?
Because the produce of our labor is stolen from us. The answer to all of our problems lies in a single word: man. Man is the only animal that consumes without producing.
True, he does not give milk. He does not lay eggs.
He is too weak to pull a plow.
And yet he is the lord of all animals. He sets us to work, gives back the bare minimum that will keep us from starving, and keeps the rest for himself.
Our labor tills the soil.
Our dung fertilizes it.
Yet there is not one of us that owns more than his own skin.
Even the miserable lives we lead are not allowed to reach their natural span. No creature escapes the cruel knife in the end. Why, you young porkers sitting in front of me, within a year, each one of you will scream your lives out of the block. To that fate we all must come. Cows, pigs, hens, everyone.
No. Even the horses?
You, Boxer. The day those great muscles of yours lose their power, Jones will sell you to the knacker, who will cut your throat and boil you down into glue. What then must we do? Why, work, night and day, body and soul, for the overthrow of the human race. That is my message to you, comrades. Rebellion! Rebellion!
Rebellion!
Rebellion! Rebellion! Fix your eyes on that, comrades. Never listen when they tell you that man and the animal have a common interest. Man serves no interest except himself. Whatever goes on 2 legs is an enemy. Whatever goes on 4 legs, or has wings, is a friend.
All animals are friends. Down with humanity!
And remember that in fighting man, we must not come to resemble him. No animal must live in a house, or sleep in a bed, or wear clothes, or drink alcohol, or smoke tobacco, or engage in trade. Above all, no animal must ever tyrannize over his own kind, weak or strong, clever or simple. We are all brothers. No animal must ever kill any other animal. All animals are equal.
All animals are equal. All animals are brothers.
And now, I shall tell you about my dream. It was a dream of the earth as it will be when man has vanished. When I was a little pig, my mother would sing me a song. It is a song of the animals of long ago, lost to memory for generations. I will sing that song for you now, comrades. I am old, and my voice is hoarse. But when I have taught it to you, you can sing it the better for yourselves. It is called Beasts of England.
Pure shall its waters be. Sweeter yet shall blow the breezes on the day that sets us free. Beasts of England, beasts of Ireland, beasts of every land and clime, hearken well and spread my tidings of the golden future time, of the golden future time.
Before Major had reached the end, even the stupidest of them had picked up the tune. The whole farm burst into Beasts of England in tremendous unison. The cows lowed it, the dogs whined it, the ducks quacked it. They were so delighted with the song that they might have continued singing all night. Unfortunately, the uproar woke Mr. Jones, who sprang out of bed, seized his gun, and stood on the corner of his bedroom wall, and let fly the number 6 shot into the darkness. The meeting broke up hurriedly.
Old Major died early in March. During the next 3 months, there was much secret activity. Major's speech had given the animals a completely new outlook on life. They did not know when the predicted rebellion would take place, but they saw it was their duty to prepare for it.
The work of organizing fell naturally on the pigs, who were generally recognized as being the cleverest of the animals. Preeminent among the pigs were 2 named Snowball and Napoleon.
Napoleon was a large, fierce-looking Berkshire boar with a reputation for getting his own way.
Snowball was a more vivacious pig, quicker in speech and more inventive,
but not considered to have the same depth of character.
All the other male pigs on the farm were porkers. The best known among them was a small, fat pig named Squealer, a brilliant talker and very persuasive.
These 3 elaborated Old Major's teachings into a complete system of thought, to which they gave the name animalism. Several nights a week, they held secret meetings in the barn and expounded the principles of animalism to the others. At the beginning, they met with such stupidity and apathy.
We should be loyal to Mr. Jones. He's our master.
Besides, he feeds us. If he were gone, wouldn't we starve to death?
Why should we care what happens after we're dead?
If this rebellion is going to happen anyway, what difference whether we work for it or not?
The stupidest questions of all were asked by Molly, the white mare.
Will there still be sugar after the rebellion?
You do not need sugar. You will have all the hay and oats you want.
And shall I still be allowed to wear ribbons in my hair?
Comrade, those ribbons you are so devoted to are a badge of slavery. Can't you understand that liberty is worth more than ribbons?
Molly agreed, but she did not sound very convinced. The pigs had an even harder time attempting to counteract the lies put out by Moses, the raven. Moses, who was Jones's special pet, claimed to know the existence of a mysterious country called
Sugar Candy Mountain. On Sugar Candy Mountain, clover is in season all year long. Linseed cake and lump sugar grows on the hedges. Oh, hallelujah, brethren! Be joyous, for the day we all shall see Sugar Candy Mountain.
The animals hated Moses because he did no work, but most of them believed in Sugar Candy Mountain, and the pigs had to argue very hard to persuade them there was no such place.
The most faithful disciples were the two horses, Boxer and Clover. These two had great difficulty in thinking anything out for themselves, but once having accepted the pigs as their teachers, they absorbed everything they were told and led the singing of Beasts of England, with which the meetings always ended.
All together now, beasts of England, beasts of Ireland, beasts of every land and kind.
Now, as it turned out, the rebellion came about much earlier than anyone had expected. On Midsummer's Eve, Mr. Jones got so drunk that he went to sleep on the drawing room sofa with a newspaper over his face. When evening came, the animals were still unfed.
At last, they could stand it no longer. One of the cows broke in the door of the store shed, and all the animals began to help themselves from the bins.
Just then, Mr. Jones woke up. The next moment, he and three of his men were in the store shed with whips, lashing out in all directions.
This was more than the hungry animals could bear. Though nothing of the kind had been planned, they flung themselves upon their tormentors.
Jones and his men suddenly found themselves being butted and kicked from all sides. This sudden uprising of creatures they were used to thrashing and maltreating frightened them almost out of their wits. They took to their heels. A minute later, all four of them were in full flight down the road, with the animals crying after them,
Get out and stay out!
And so, almost before the animals knew what was happening, the rebellion had been successfully carried through. Jones was expelled, and the Manor Farm was theirs.
Their first act was to wipe out the last traces of Jones' hated reign. The harness room was broken open. The bits, the nose rings, the cruel knives Mr. Jones had used to castrate the pigs and lambs, all were flung down the well.
The reins, the halters, the blinkers, and the degrading nose bags were thrown on the rubbish fire. So were the whips.
Snowball also threw onto the fire the ribbons with which the horses' manes and tails had been decorated on market days, explaining,
Ribbons should be considered as clothes, which are the mark of the human being. All animals shall go naked.
When Boxer heard this, he fetched the small straw hat he wore in the summer to keep the flies out of his ears and flung it on the fire with the rest.
In a very little while, the animals had destroyed everything that reminded them of Mr. Jones. Then they filed back to the farmhouse and halted outside the door.
After a moment, Snowball and Napoleon butted the door open, and the animals entered. They tiptoed from room to room, gazing with a kind of awe at the unbelievable luxury, at the beds with their feather mattresses, the looking glasses, the sofa made of horsehair, the Brussels carpet, the lithograph of Queen Victoria over the drawing room mantelpiece.
As they were coming down the stairs, Molly was discovered to be missing. Going back, the others found her in the best bedroom. She had taken a piece of blue ribbon from Mrs. Jones's dressing table and was holding it against her shoulder, admiring herself in the glass.
The others reproached her sharply and went outside. Some hams hanging in the kitchen were taken out for burial. A unanimous resolution was passed on the spot that the farmhouse should be preserved as a museum. All agreed that no animal must ever live there.
The next day, Snowball and Napoleon called them all together again and revealed that during the past 3 months, the pigs had taught themselves to read and write.
Napoleon sent for pots of paint and led the way to the gate that gave onto the main road.
Snowball painted out the name Manor Farm from the top bar of the gate, and, in its place, painted Animal Farm.
After this, they went back to the farm buildings, where Snowball and Napoleon set a ladder against the end wall of the big barn. They explained that the pigs had succeeded in reducing the principles of animalism to 7 commandments. These would now be inscribed on the wall and would form an unalterable law by which all the animals on Animal Farm must live forever after.
With some difficulty, for it is not easy for a pig to balance himself on a ladder, Snowball climbed up and set to work. The commandments were written on the wall in great white letters.
Whatever goes upon 2 legs is an enemy.
Whatever goes upon 4 legs or has wings is a friend.
No animal shall wear clothes.
No animal shall sleep in a bed.
No animal shall drink alcohol.
No animal shall kill any other animal.
All animals are equal.
It was all very neatly written, except that all of the S's were the wrong way round. Snowball read it aloud. All of the animals nodded in complete agreement, and the clever ones at once began to learn the commandments by heart.
But at this moment, the 3 cows set up a loud lowing. They had not been milked for hours, and their udders were bursting. The pigs sent for buckets and milked the cows fairly successfully. Soon there were 5 buckets of frothing, creamy milk, at which many of the animals looked with considerable interest.
What's going to happen to all that milk?
Jones used to mix it in some of our mash.
Never mind the milk, comrades. The harvest is more important. Comrade Snowball will lead the way. I shall follow in a few minutes. Forward, comrades. The hay is waiting.
So the animals trooped down to the hayfield to begin the harvest. And when they came back in the evening, it was noticed that the milk had disappeared.
How they toiled and sweated to get the hay in, but their efforts were rewarded, for the harvest was an even bigger success than they had hoped.
The work was hard. The implements had been designed for human beings, and no animal was able to use any tool that involved standing on his hind legs. But the pigs were so clever that they could think of a way around every difficulty.
The pigs did not actually do any work, but supervised the others. Boxer and Clover would harness themselves to the cutter or horse rake. No bit or reins were needed, of course, and tramped steadily around and around the field with the pig walking beside and calling out,
Gee there, comrade. Whoa there, comrade.
Every animal down to the humblest worked. Even the ducks and hens toiled to and fro, carrying tiny wisps of hay in their beaks. In the end, they finished the harvest in 2 days less time than it had usually taken Jones and his men. Moreover, it was the biggest harvest the farm had ever seen.
The work of the farm went like clockwork. The animals were happy as they had never conceived it possible to be. Every mouthful of food was a positive pleasure now that it was truly their own food, produced by themselves and for themselves.
Boxer was the admiration of everybody. From morning to night, he was always at the spot where the work was hardest. He had made arrangements with one of the cockerels to call him in the mornings half an hour earlier than anyone else, and would labor at whatever seemed most needed before the regular day's work began. His personal motto was, "I will work harder."
Nobody shirked. Or almost nobody. Molly would vanish for hours, then reappear at mealtimes. But she always had such excellent excuses that it was impossible not to believe in her good intentions.
Only old Benjamin, the donkey, seemed quite unchanged. He did his work in the same slow, obstinate way as in Jones's time, never shirking and never volunteering for extra work either. About the rebellion, he would express no opinion. When asked whether he was not happier now that Jones was gone, he would only say cryptically,
Nobody's ever seen a dead donkey.
On Sundays, all the animals trooped into the big barn for a general assembly. Here, the work of the coming week was planned, and resolutions were debated. It was always the pigs who put forward the resolutions. The other animals could not think of any. Snowball and Napoleon were by far the most active in the debates, but it was noticed that whatever suggestion either of them made, the other could be counted on to oppose it.
Snowball busied himself organizing committees. He formed the Egg Production Committee for the hens, the Clean Tails Committee for the cows, and the Wild Comrades Re-Education Committee. The object of this last was to tame the rats and rabbits, but the project broke down almost immediately.
The cat joined the Re-Education Committee and was very active in it. For a while, she was seen one day sitting on a roof and talking to some sparrows who were just out of her reach. She was telling them that all animals were now comrades and that any sparrow who chose could come and perch on her paw. But the sparrows kept their distance.
By autumn, almost every animal on the farm was literate to some degree. The pigs could read and write perfectly. The dogs learned to read fairly well. Muriel the goat could read somewhat better than the dogs. Benjamin could read as well as any pig, but never exercised his faculty. He said,
"Far as I can see, there's nothing worth reading."
Clover learned the whole alphabet, but she could never put words together.
Boxer couldn't get beyond the letter D. He would trace out A, B, C, D in the dust with his hoof, then stand staring at the letters, trying with all his might to remember what came next. On several occasions, he did learn E, F, G, H, but by the time he knew them, he had forgotten A, B, C, and D.
Molly refused to learn any but the letters which spelt her own name. She would form these very neatly out of pieces of twig, then decorate them with a flower or two, and walk around them, admiring them.
None of the other animals could get farther than the letter A. It was also found that the stupider animals, such as the sheep, hens, and ducks, were unable to learn the 7 commandments by heart. After much thought, Snowball solved this problem.
Comrades, for your benefit, I have reduced the 7 commandments to a single maxim. Listen carefully. 4 legs good, 2 legs bad. 4 legs good, 2 legs bad. Now, repeat after me. 4 legs good,
4 legs good,
2 legs bad.
2 legs bad.
Excellent. Now, all together once more.
4 legs
Good.
good, 2 legs
Bad.
2 legs bad.
Now, once again.
4 legs good, 2 legs bad. 4 legs good, 2 legs bad.
This maxim was inscribed on the wall of the barn. Once they had it by heart, the sheep developed a great liking for the maxim, and often as they lay in the field would all start bleating.
4 legs good, 2 legs bad. 4 legs good, 2 legs bad.
And keep it up for hours on end.
2 legs bad. 4 legs good.
Napoleon took no interest in Snowball's committees. He said education of the young was more important. 2 farm dogs had whelped soon after the harvest, giving birth to 4 sturdy puppies. As soon as they were weaned, Napoleon took them, saying he would make himself responsible for their education. He took them to a loft over the harness room, and there kept them in such seclusion that the rest of the animals quite forgot their existence.
The mystery of where the milk went was soon cleared up. It was mixed every day into the pig's mash. The early apples were now ripening, and the orchard was littered with windfalls. The animals had assumed these would be shared equally. One day, however, the order went forth that all windfalls were to be brought to the harness room for the use of the pigs. At this, some of the other animals murmured. Squealer was sent to make the necessary explanations.
Comrades, surely you do not imagine we pigs are doing this in a spirit of selfishness or privilege. Many of us actually dislike milk and apples. Our sole object is to preserve our health. Milk and apples, this has been proven by science, comrades, contain substances absolutely necessary to the well-being of the pig. We pigs are brain workers. The whole management of the farm depends on us. It is for your sake that we drink that milk and eat those apples. Do you know what would happen if we pigs failed in our duty? Jones would come back. Surely, comrades, there is no one among you who wants to see Jones come back.
Now, if there was one thing the animals were completely certain of, it was that they did not want Jones back. When it was put to them in this light, they had no more to say. So it was agreed that the milk and the windfall apples, and also the main crop of apples when they ripened, should be reserved for the pigs alone.
Every day, Snowball and Napoleon sent out flights of pigeons to tell animals on neighboring farms the story of the rebellion and teach them beasts of England.
Most of this time, Mr. Jones spent sitting in the tap room of the Red Lion Inn, complaining to anyone who would listen of the monstrous injustice he had suffered. The other farmers didn't give him much help. Each was secretly wondering how he could turn Jones's misfortune to his own advantage.
The owners of the two farms, which adjoined Animal Farm, were on permanently bad terms. One of the farms, named Foxwood, was a large, neglected, old-fashioned place, much overgrown by woodland. Its owner, Mr. Pilkington, was an easygoing gentleman farmer who spent most of his time hunting or fishing.
The other farm, Pinchfield, was smaller and better kept. Its owner was a Mr. Frederick, a tough, shrewd man with a name for driving hard bargains.
These two disliked each other so much that it was difficult for them to come to any agreement. But they were both thoroughly frightened by the rebellion on Animal Farm and anxious to prevent their own animals from learning too much about it.
At first, they pretended to scorn the idea of animals managing a farm for themselves. The whole thing would be over in a fortnight, they said. They put it about that the animals were perpetually fighting amongst themselves and were also rapidly starving to death. But as time passed, and the animals had evidently not starved to death, Frederick and Pilkington changed their tune and began to talk about the terrible wickedness that had flourished on Animal Farm. It was given out that the animals there practiced cannibalism, tortured one another with red-hot horseshoes, and had their females in common.
However, these stories were never fully believed. Rumors of a wonderful farm where animals managed their own affairs continued to circulate, and a wave of rebelliousness ran through the countryside. Bulls, which had always been tractable, suddenly turned savage. Sheep broke down hedges and devoured the clover. Cows kicked over the pail. Above all, the words and tune of Beasts of England were known everywhere. The blackbirds whistled in the hedges, the pigeons cooed in the elms. It got into the din of the smithies and the chime of the church bells. And when the human beings listened to it, they secretly trembled. Hearing it is a prophecy of their future doom.
Early in October, a flight of pigeons came whirling through the air to alight in the yard of Animal Farm in the wildest excitement. Jones and his men were entering the gate. They were all carrying sticks, except Jones, who was marching ahead with a gun in his hands. Obviously, they were going to attempt to recapture the farm.
Snowball, who had studied an old book of Julius Caesar's campaigns, gave orders quickly, and in a couple of minutes, every animal was at his post. As the human beings approached the farm buildings, Snowball launched his first attack. All the pigeons flew over the men's heads and muted on them from mid-air, and while the men were dealing with this, the geese rushed out and pecked viciously at their legs. However, the men easily drove the geese off with their sticks.
Snowball now launched a second line of attack. Muriel, Benjamin, and all the sheep, with Snowball at their head, rushed forward and prodded and butted the men, while Benjamin turned around and lashed them with his hooves. But once again, the men were too strong for them. Suddenly, at a squeal from Snowball, all the animals turned and fled through the gateway into the yard.
The men gave a shout of triumph. Hurrah! They saw, as they imagined, their enemies in flight and rushed after them in disorder.
This was exactly what Snowball had intended. As soon as they were inside the yard, the horses, the cows, and the rest of the pigs who had been lying in ambush in the cowshed suddenly emerged in their rear. Snowball gave the signal for the charge. He himself dashed straight for Jones.
Jones raised his gun and fired.
Snowball flung himself against Jones' legs. Jones was hurled into a pile of dung, and his gun flew out of his hands.
The most terrifying spectacle was Boxer rearing up on his hind legs and striking out with his great iron-shod hooves like a stallion. His very first blow took a stable boy on the skull and stretched him lifeless in the mud.
At this sight, several men dropped their attack and tried to run. Panic overtook them, and the next moment all the animals were chasing them round and round the yard. They were gored, kicked, bitten, trampled on. Within 5 minutes of the invasion, they were in ignominious retreat, with a flock of geese hissing after them.
The animals reassembled in wildest excitement, each recounting his own exploits in the battle at the top of his voice. An impromptu celebration of the victory was held immediately. Napoleon made a little speech, emphasizing the need of all animals to be ready to die for Animal Farm if need be.
The animals decided to create a military decoration, Animal Hero First Class, consisting of a brass medal to be worn on Sundays and holidays. It was conferred then and there on Snowball and Boxer.
There was much discussion as to what the battle should be called. In the end, it was named the Battle of the Cowshed, since that was where the ambush had taken place. Mr. Jones's gun was set up at the foot of the flagstaff to be fired twice a year, once on the anniversary of the Battle of the Cowshed, and once on the anniversary of the rebellion.
As winter drew on, Molly became more and more troublesome. She was late for work every morning and complained of mysterious pains, though her appetite was excellent. One day, Clover took her aside.
Molly, I have something very serious to say to you. This morning, I saw you looking over the hedge that divides Animal Farm from Foxwood. And on the other side was one of Mr. Pilkington's men, and you were allowing him to stroke your nose. What does this mean, Molly?
He didn't. I wasn't. It isn't true.
Look me in the face. Do you give me your word of honor that the man was not stroking your nose?
It isn't true. But she could not look Clover in the face. And the next moment, she took to her heels and galloped away. For some weeks, nothing was known of her whereabouts. Then some pigeons reported they had seen her between the shafts of a smart dog cart standing outside a public house. A fat, red-faced man was stroking her nose and feeding her sugar. Her coat was newly clipped, and she wore a scarlet ribbon round her forelock. None of the animals ever mentioned Molly again.
In January, the earth was like iron, and nothing could be done in the fields. The pigs occupied themselves with planning the work of the coming season. It had come to be accepted that the pigs should decide all questions of farm policy, though their decisions had to be ratified by a majority vote. This arrangement would have worked out well had it not been for Snowball and Napoleon. These two disagreed at every point where disagreement was possible. Each had his own following, and there were some violent debates. At the meeting, Snowball often won over the majority by his brilliant speeches.
But Napoleon was better at canvassing support for himself in between times. He was especially successful with the sheep. Snowball often had the greatest difficulty in finishing a speech.
4 legs good, 2 legs bad. 4 legs good, 2
I have something to tell you.
4 legs good, 2 legs bad. 4 legs good, 2 legs bad.
Nevertheless, Snowball was full of plans for innovations and improvements.
4 legs good.
Napoleon produced no schemes of his own, but said that snowballs would come to nothing, and seemed to be biding his time.
Of all their controversies, none was so bitter as the one that took place over the windmill. In the long pasture was a small knoll, the highest point on the farm. Snowball declared this was just the place for a windmill, which could be made to operate a dynamo.
Snowball used as his study a shed which had a smooth wooden floor suitable for drawing on. Gradually, his plans grew into a complicated mass of cranks and cogwheels covering more than half the floor, which the other animals found completely unintelligible, but very impressive. All of them came to look at Snowball's drawings at least once a day.
Napoleon had declared himself against the windmill from the start. One day he arrived unexpectedly to examine the plans. He walked heavily around the shed, looked closely at every detail, stood for a while, contemplating them out of the corner of his eye, then suddenly lifted his leg, urinated over the plans, and walked out without uttering a word.
At last, the question of whether or not to begin work on the windmill was to be put to the vote. When the animals were assembled, Snowball stood up and set forth his reasons in glowing terms.
A whole new life opens to us, comrades. A life of ease and luxury. Electricity will operate thrashing machines, plows, harrows, reapers, and binders, besides supplying every stall with its own electric light, hot and cold running water, and an electric heater.
By the time he had finished speaking, there was no doubt as to which way the vote would go. But at this moment, Napoleon uttered a high-pitched whimper of a kind no one had ever heard before. At this, there was a terrible baying, and 4 enormous dogs came bounding into the barn. They dashed straight for Snowball, who sprang from his place barely in time to escape their snapping jaws.
In a flash, he was out of the door, and they after him. Too amazed to speak, the animals crowded through the door to watch the chase.
Snowball was racing across the pasture, the dogs close on his heels. Once he slipped, and one of them all but closed his jaws on his tail, but Snowball whisked free just in time, put on an extra spurt, slipped through a hole in the hedge, and was seen no more.
Silent and terrified, the animals crept back into the barn. In a moment, the dogs came bounding back. At first, no one could imagine where these creatures came from. But the problem was soon solved. They were the puppies Napoleon had taken away and reared privately. Though not yet full-grown, they were as fierce as wolves. They kept close to Napoleon and wagged their tails to him in the same way as the other dogs used to do to Mr. Jones. Napoleon now spoke.
Comrades, hear me. From now on, all questions of farm management will be settled by a special committee of pigs, over which I, Napoleon, shall preside. You will still assemble on Sundays to sing Beasts of England, salute the flag, and receive your orders for the week. But there will be no more debates.
4 young porkers in the front row uttered shrill squeals of disapproval, sprang to their feet, and began speaking all at once. But the dogs let out deep, menacing growls, and the pigs fell silent.
Afterwards, Squealer was sent around the farm to explain the new arrangement to the others.
Comrades, I trust every animal appreciates the sacrifice Comrade Napoleon has made in taking on this extra labor to himself. No one believes more firmly than Comrade Napoleon that all animals are equal. He would be only too happy to let you make your decisions for yourselves, but suppose you had decided to follow Snowball, who, we now know, was no more than a criminal.
He fought bravely at the Battle of Cowshed.
Bravery is not enough. Loyalty and obedience are more important. As to the Battle of the Cowshed, Snowball's part in it was very much exaggerated. Discipline, comrades. Iron discipline. That is the watchword. One false step and our enemies will be upon us. Surely you do not want Jones back.
Once again, this argument was unanswerable. Certainly, the animals did not want Jones back. If the holding of debates on Sunday mornings was liable to bring him back, then the debates must stop. Boxer voiced the general feeling.
Comrade Napoleon says it. It must be right.
And from then on, he adopted the second maxim
Napoleon is always right.
and added it to his private motto.
I will work harder.
On the 3rd Sunday after Snowball's expulsion, the animals were surprised to hear Napoleon announce that the windmill was to be built after all. That evening, Squealer explained to the other animals that Napoleon had never really been opposed to the windmill.
On the contrary, comrades, the plans Snowball drew on the floor of the shed were actually stolen from Napoleon. The windmill was, in fact, Napoleon's creation.
And why did he speak so strongly against it?
Oh, comrade, that was Comrade Napoleon's cunning. He pretended to oppose the windmill to get rid of that dangerous character, Snowball. Now, with Snowball out of the way, the plan can go through. Strategy, comrades. That is called strategy.
The animals were not certain what the word meant, but Squealer spoke with such assurance, and the dogs with him growled so threateningly, that they accepted his explanation without further question. All that year, the animals worked like slaves. Throughout the spring and summer, they worked a 60-hour week. And in August, Napoleon announced there would be work on Sunday afternoons as well.
This work will be strictly voluntary, comrades, strictly voluntary. However, any animal who fails to volunteer will have his rations reduced by half.
The windmill presented unexpected difficulties. There was a good limestone quarry on the farm, but the problem was how to break up the stones without picks or crowbars, which no animal could use. Only after some weeks did the idea occur to somebody to utilize the force of gravity. Huge boulders were lying all over the bed of the quarry. The animals latched ropes around these, then dragged them up to the top of the slope where they toppled over the edge below. Frequently, it took a whole day of exhausting labor to drag a single boulder to the top of the quarry.
Nothing could have been achieved without Boxer. To see him toiling up the slope, inch by inch, his breath coming fast, the tips of his hooves clawing at the ground, and his great sides matted with sweat, filled everyone with admiration. Clover warned him not to overstrain himself, but Boxer would not listen. He had made arrangements with the cockerel to call him 3/4 of an hour earlier in the mornings instead of half an hour. In his spare moments, he would go alone to the quarry, collect a load of broken stones, and drag it to the windmill unassisted.
One Sunday morning, Napoleon announced a new policy.
From now on, Animal Farm will engage in trade with neighboring farms.
What? But, Comrade Napoleon.
The needs of the windmill must override everything else. I'm therefore making arrangements to sell a stack of hay and a part of this year's wheat crop.
But Comrade Napoleon, this means dealing with humans.
True, comrade, and I have taken care of that. There will be no need for any of you to come in contact with human beings. A Mr. Whymper has agreed to act as intermediary between Animal Farm and the outside world.
Thus, every Monday, Mr. Whymper visited the farm. The animals avoided him as much as possible. Nevertheless, the sight of Napoleon on all fours delivering orders to a man who stood on 2 legs roused their pride and partly reconciled them to the new arrangement.
It was about this time that the pigs suddenly moved into the farmhouse. The animals seemed to remember that a resolution in the past was made against this, but Squealer was able to convince them that this was not the case.
It is absolutely necessary, comrades, that we pigs should have a quiet place to work. It is also more suited to the dignity of Napoleon. Comrades, you would not want to see our noble leader living in a mere sty, would you?
Nevertheless, the animals were disturbed when they learned that not only had the pigs taken their meals into the kitchen and used the drawing room as a recreation room, but also slept in the beds. Boxer passed it off with,
Napoleon is always right.
But Clover went to the barn and tried to puzzle out the 7 commandments inscribed there.
Muriel, read me the 4th commandment. Doesn't it say something about never sleeping in a bed?
With some difficulty, Muriel spelled it out.
No, Clover. It says, no animal shall sleep in a bed with sheets.
Clover had not remembered that the commandment mentioned sheets, but since it was written on the wall, it must be so. Squealer was able to put this whole matter in its proper perspective.
You have heard then, comrades, that we pigs now sleep in the beds at the farmhouse. And why not? A bed is merely a place to sleep. The rule was against sheets, which are a man-made invention. We have removed the sheets from the bed and sleep between blankets. You would not want to rob us of our repose, comrades, would you? Surely you do not want Jones back.
No more was said about the pigs sleeping in the farmhouse beds. And when it was announced that from now on the pigs would get up an hour later in the mornings than the other animals, no complaint was made about that either.
All this while, no more had been seen of Snowball. He was rumored to be in hiding in one of the neighboring Foxwood or Pinchfield. Now, it happened that there was in a yard a pile of timber, which both Mr. Pilkington and Mr. Frederick were anxious to buy. Napoleon was hesitating between the two. Whenever he seemed to favor making an agreement with Frederick, Snowball was declared to be hiding at Foxwood, while when he was inclined towards Pilkington, Snowball was said to be at Pinchfield.
Suddenly, early in spring, an alarming thing was reported. Snowball was secretly invading the farm by night. Every night, it was said, he came creeping in under cover of darkness to perform all kinds of mischief. He stole the corn, upset the milk pails, broke the eggs. He trampled the seed beds. He gnawed the bark off the fruit trees.
Napoleon decreed a full investigation. With his dogs, he made a careful tour of the farm buildings. In the evening, Squealer had serious news to report.
Comrades, a most terrible thing has been discovered. Snowball has sold himself to Frederick of Pinchfield, who is plotting to attack us.
Oh no!
Yes, but there is worse than that. Snowball has been in league with Jones from the very start. This has been proved by documents which we have just discovered. This explains a great deal, comrades. Did we not see for ourselves how he attempted to get us defeated at the Battle of the Cowshed?
The animals were stupefied. They all remembered, or thought they remembered, Snowball charging ahead of them at the Battle of the Cowshed. It was a little difficult to see how this fitted in with his being on Jones's side.
I don't understand. Snowball fought bravely at the Battle of the Cowshed. Didn't we give him Animal Hero First Class immediately afterward?
That was our mistake, comrade. We know now that in reality he was trying to lure us to our doom.
But he was wounded. We all saw him running with blood.
That was part of the plot. Jones' shot only grazed him. The plan was for Snowball at the critical moment to get the signal for flight and leave the field to the enemy, and he very nearly succeeded. Comrade, he would have succeeded if it had not been for our heroic leader, Napoleon. Do we not remember how just at the moment when Jones and his men were inside the yard, Snowball turned and fled? And do you not remember, too, how at that very moment, Napoleon sprang forward with a cry of death to humanity and sank his teeth into Jones' leg?
Now that Squealer described this scene so graphically, it seemed to the animals that they did remember it. But Boxer was still uneasy.
I don't understand. Snowball fought bravely at the Battle of the Cowshed.
Comrade Boxer, our leader, Comrade Napoleon, has stated categorically, comrade, that Snowball was in league with Jones from the very start.
That's different. If Comrade Napoleon says it, it must be right.
That's the true spirit. I warn every animal to keep his eyes wide open. We have good reason to suspect that at this very moment, some of Snowball's agents are lurking among us.
4 days later, Napoleon emerged from the farmhouse with his 4 dogs frisking around him. He stood sternly, surveying his audience for a moment, then...
Seize them!
Immediately, the dogs seized 4 of the pigs by the ear and dragged them squealing with terror to Napoleon's feet. The pigs' ears were bleeding, the dogs had tasted blood, and for a few moments they appeared to go quite mad. To the amazement of everybody, 2 of them flung themselves upon Boxer.
Boxer put out his great hoof, caught one dog in midair and pinned him to the ground. The dog shrieked for mercy. Boxer looked at Napoleon to know whether he should crush the dog to death.
Let him go.
Boxer lifted his hoof, and the dog slunk away. Presently, the tumult died.
The 4 pigs waited, trembling. They were the same 4 who had protested when Napoleon abolished the Sunday meetings.
Comrades, in the name of the rebellion, I call upon you now to confess your heinous crimes.
Without further prompting, the porkers confessed that they had been secretly in touch with Snowball ever since his expulsion, and had entered into an agreement to hand over the farm to Mr. Frederick. They added that Snowball had privately admitted to them that he had been Mr. Jones's secret agent for years. When they had finished their confessions, the dogs promptly tore their throats out.
Has anyone else anything they would like to confess?
3 hens now stated that Snowball had appeared to them in a dream and incited them to disobey Napoleon's orders. Then the pigs confessed to having secreted 6 ears of corn and eaten them in the night. Then a sheep confessed to having urinated in the drinking pool, urged to do this by Snowball. They were all slain on the spot.
So the tale of confessions and executions went on and on, until there was a pile of corpses lying before Napoleon's feet, and the air was heavy with the smell of blood. When it was all over, the animals crept away in a body, shaken and miserable. They made their way to the little knoll where the half-finished windmill stood. Boxers seemed bewildered by it all.
I do not understand. I would not have believed such things could happen on our farm. The problem must be some fault in ourselves. The solution, as I see it, is to work harder. From now on, I will get up a whole hour earlier in the mornings.
And Boxer made for the quarry. The other animals huddled around Clover, not speaking. The knoll where they were lying gave them a wide prospect across the countryside. Most of Animal Farm was within their view. The long pasture stretching down to the main road. The hayfield, the spinney, the drinking pool, the plowed fields where the young wheat was thick and green, and the red roofs of the farmhouse buildings with smoke curling from the chimneys. It was a clear spring evening. The grass and bursting hedges were gilded by the level rays of the sun. Never had the farm seemed so desirable to them. As Clover looked down the hillside, her eyes filled with tears.
Surely, this is not what we looked forward to when old Major first stirred us to rebellion. He told of a society of animals set free from hunger and the whip, all equal, each working according to his capacity, the strong protecting the weak. What has happened to us? We have come to a time when no one dares speak his mind, when fierce, growling dogs roam everywhere. You have to watch your comrades torn to pieces. Oh, things are far better off than the days of Jones. And before all else, it is needful to prevent the return of the human beings. But it is not for this that we have hoped and toiled. It is not for this that we face the bullets of Jones's gun.
Such were Clover's thoughts, though she lacked the words to express them. At last, feeling it to be in some way a substitute for the words they were unable to find, the animals began singing Beasts of England.
Beasts of England, beasts of Ireland, beasts of every land and clime, hearken to my joyful tidings of the golden future time.
They sang it slowly and mournfully, in a way they never had before, until suddenly the squealer appeared.
Stop! Comrades, hear me! Stop singing that song. Beasts of England has been abolished. From now on, it is forbidden to sing it.
What? But why?
Because it is no longer needed. Beasts of England is the song of rebellion, but the rebellion is now complete. The execution of the traitors this afternoon was the final act. In Beasts of England, we express our longing for a better society to come, but that society has now been established. Clearly, the song no longer has any purpose. We have a new song which I will teach you now. Animal farm, never through me shalt thou come to harm.
The new anthem was sung every Sunday morning after the hoisting of the flag. But somehow, neither the words nor the tune ever seemed to the animals to come up to Beasts of England. A few days later, when the terror caused by the executions had died down, some of the animals thought they remembered that the Sixth Commandment decreed no animal should kill any other animal. It was felt that the killings which had taken place did not square with this.
Clover asked Benjamin to read her the Sixth Commandment.
Not I. Nobody has ever seen a dead donkey.
And when Benjamin refused to meddle in such matters, she fetched Muriel to read the commandment for her.
It says, no animal shall kill any other animal without cause.
Somehow or other, these last two words had slipped everyone's memory. But they saw now that the commandment had not been violated, for clearly there was good reason for killing the traitors who had leagued themselves with Snowball.
Throughout that year, the animals worked even harder than the previous year. At times it seemed they worked long hours and fed no better than in Jones's day, but on Sunday mornings, Squealer would read them long, reassuring lists of figures.
Production report for the week just completed. Hay production up 200%, grains 300%, eggs 400%, and milk 506.2%.
The animals saw no reason to disbelieve these impressive figures. All the same, Benjamin expressed the general sentiment when he said,
I'd rather have less figures and more food.
All orders were now issued through Squealer. Napoleon himself was not seen in public once in a fortnight. Even in the farmhouse, Napoleon inhabited separate apartments, took his meals alone, and always ate from the Crown Derby dinner service. It was also announced that the gun would be fired every year on Napoleon's birthday, as well as on the other two anniversaries.
Napoleon was now always referred to in formal style as our leader, Comrade Napoleon, and the pigs liked to invent for him such titles as Father of all animals, Protector of the sheepfold, Duckling's friend, and the like. In his speeches, Squealer would talk with the tears running down his cheeks of Napoleon's wisdom, the goodness of his heart, and the deep love he bore to all animals everywhere. It had become customary to give Napoleon the credit for every successful achievement. You would often hear one hen remark to another,
Under the guidance of our leader, Comrade Napoleon, I have laid 5 eggs in 6 days.
Or two sheep, drinking at a pool, would exclaim,
Thanks to our leader, Comrade Napoleon, how excellent this water tastes.
Meanwhile, Napoleon was engaged in complicated negotiations with Frederick and Pilkington. The pile of timber was still unsold. Frederick was the more anxious to get hold of it, but he would not offer a reasonable price. At the same time, there were renewed rumors that Frederick and his men were plotting to attack Animal Farm and destroy the windmill.
Frederick plots to bring against us 20 men, all armed with guns. And comrades, have you heard of the terrible cruelties Frederick practices on his animals? He flogged an old horse to death. He starves his cows. He killed his dog by throwing it in the furnace. And in the evenings, he amuses himself by making cocks fight with splinters of razor blades tied to their spurs.
The animals' blood boiled with rage when they heard of these things, and sometimes they clamored to be allowed to attack Pinchfield Farm and set the animals free.
Napoleon explained that he had never contemplated selling the timber to Frederick. The pigeons, who were still sent out to spread tidings of the rebellion, were forbidden to set foot on Pinchfield, and were ordered to drop their former slogan of death to humanity in favor of death to Frederick.
In the late summer, yet another of Snowball's machinations was laid bare. The wheat crop was full of weeds, and it was discovered that on one of his nocturnal visits, Snowball had mixed weed seeds with the seed corn. A gander, who had been privy to the plot, confessed his guilt and immediately committed suicide by swallowing deadly nightshade berries.
The animals now also learned that Snowball had never received the Order of Animal Hero First Class, as many of them had believed.
This was merely a legend circulated by Snowball himself. Far from being decorated, he was actually censured for cowardice in the battle.
By autumn, the windmill was finished. Tired but proud, the animals walked round and round their masterpiece, which appeared beautiful in their eyes. When they thought of how they had labored, what discouragements they had overcome, and the enormous difference that would be made in their lives when the sails were turning and the dynamos running, their weariness forsook them, and they gamboled round and round the windmill, uttering cries of triumph. Napoleon himself came to inspect the completed work, congratulated the animals on their achievement, and dedicated the edifice.
I hereby name this structure Napoleon Mill.
2 days later, the animals were struck dumb with surprise to learn that Napoleon had sold the pile of timber to Frederick. Throughout the whole of his seeming friendship with Pilkington, he had really been in secret agreement with Frederick.
The pigs were in ecstasies over Napoleon's cunning. By seeming to be friendly with Pilkington, he had forced Frederick to raise his price by 12 pounds. Squealer gloated.
The superior quality of Napoleon's mind was shown in the fact that he trusted nobody. Frederick wanted to pay for the timber with something called a check, but our leader was too clever for it. He demanded payment in real 5-pound notes to be handed over before the timber is removed.
Frederick removed the timber with amazing speed, but 3 days later there was a terrible hullabaloo. Whimper, his face deadly pale, came racing up the path on his bicycle and rushed straight to the farmhouse. The next moment, the animals heard a choking roar of rage from Napoleon's apartment.
Death! Death to Frederick!
News of what had happened spread around the farm like wildfire. The banknotes were forgeries. Frederick had got the timber for nothing.
Napoleon called the animals together and in a terrible voice pronounced judgment on Frederick.
When captured, he shall be boiled alive.
At the same time, he warned them that after this treacherous deed, Frederick and his men might make their long-expected attack at any moment. 4 pigeons were sent to Foxwood with a conciliatory message, which it was hoped might re-establish good relations with Pilkington.
The very next morning, the attack came. The lookouts came racing in with the news that Frederick and his men had come through the gate. Boldly, the animals sallied forth to meet them, but this time, they did not have the easy victory that they had in the Battle of the Cowshed. There were 15 men with half a dozen guns, and they opened fire as soon as they got within 50 yards.
The animals took refuge in the farm buildings and peeped cautiously out from chinks and knotholes. The whole of the big pasture, including the windmill, was in the hands of the enemy.
Napoleon seemed at a loss. He paced up and down, casting wistful glances in the direction of Foxwood. If Pilkington and his men would help, the day might be won. But at this moment, a message was delivered.
A message from Pilkington, Comrade Napoleon.
Quickly, what does it say?
Is he coming?
Will he help us?
What does it say?
It says, serves you right.
Frederick and his men halted at the windmill. 2 of the men produced a crowbar and a sledgehammer. The animals watched them, and a murmur of dismay went round.
They're going to knock the windmill down.
Impossible. They could not knock it down in a week. The balls are too thick. Courage, comrades!
But the men were drilling a hole in the base of the windmill. Slowly, and with an air almost of amusement, Benjamin nodded his long muzzle.
I thought so. Do you see what they're doing? They're packing blasting powder to that hole.
In a few minutes, there was a sudden deafening roar. All the animals flung themselves flat on their faces. When they got up again, a huge cloud of smoke was hanging where the windmill had been. Slowly, the breeze drifted it away. The windmill had ceased to exist. At this sight, the animals' fear and despair were drowned in their rage against this vile, contemptible act. A mighty cry of vengeance went up, and without waiting for orders from Napoleon, they charged forth in a body and made straight for the enemy. This time, they did not heed the cruel pellets that swept them like hail. It was a savage and bitter battle. A cow, 3 sheep, and 2 geese were killed, and nearly everyone was wounded, except Napoleon, who was directing operations from the rear.
The men did not go unscathed either. 2 of them had their heads broken by blows from Boxer's hooves. Another was gored in the belly by a cow's horn. And when the 4 dogs suddenly appeared on the men's flank, bang ferociously, the cowardly enemy turned and ran for dear life. The animals chased them right down to the bottom of the field and got in some last kicks at them as they forced their way through the thorn hedge.
Weary and bleeding, the animals began to limp back to the farm. They halted in sorrowful silence at the place where the windmill had once stood. It was gone. Almost the last trace of their labor was gone. It was as though the windmill had never been.
But as they approached the farm, Squealer, who had unaccountably been absent during the fight, came skipping toward them beaming. From the direction of the farm buildings, they heard the solemn firing of a gun.
What is that gun firing for?
To celebrate our victory.
Victory? What victory?
What victory, comrades? Have we not driven the enemy off the sacred soil of Animal Farm?
But they have destroyed the windmill.
What matter? We'll build another windmill. We'll build 6 windmills if we feel like it. You do not appreciate, comrade, the mighty thing we have done. The enemy was an occupation of the very ground we stand on. Now, thanks to the leadership of Comrade Napoleon, we have won back every inch of it.
And we've won back what we had before.
That is our victory.
Boxer, who had suffered a split hoof, limped painfully back into the yard. He saw ahead of him the heavy labor of rebuilding the windmill from its foundations, and already in imagination braced himself for the task. But for the first time, it occurred to him that he was 11 years old, and his great muscles were not what they had once been.
But when the animals heard Napoleon's speech, congratulating them on their conduct, it did seem to them that, after all, they had won a great victory. The animals slain in the battle were given a solemn funeral. It was announced that the battle would be called the Battle of the Windmill.
And Napoleon created a new decoration, the Order of the Green Banner, which he conferred upon himself.
A few days later, the pigs came upon a case of whiskey in the cellar of the farmhouse, overlooked when the house was first occupied. That night, there came from the farmhouse the sound of raucous singing. At about 9:30, Napoleon, wearing an old bowler hat of Mr. Jones's, was distinctly seen to emerge from the back door, gallop rapidly around the yard, and disappear indoors again.
But in the morning, a deep silence hung over the farmhouse. Not a pig appeared to be stirring. It was nearly 9 o'clock before Squealer made his appearance, walking slowly and dejectedly, his eyes dull, with every appearance of being seriously ill. He called the animals together and told them he had terrible news to impart.
Comrades, Comrade Napoleon is dying.
A cry of lamentation went up. With tears in their eyes, the animals asked one another what they should do if their leader were taken from them. A rumor went round that Snowball had contrived to poison Napoleon. At 11 o'clock, Squealer came to make another announcement.
As his last act on earth, Comrade Napoleon has pronounced a solemn decree. The drinking of alcohol shall be punished by death.
By evening, however, Napoleon appeared to be somewhat better. The following morning, Squealer was able to tell them he was well on his way to recovery. And the next day it was learned that he had instructed Whymper to purchase some books on brewing and distilling. The small paddock beyond the orchard was to be plowed up. Napoleon intended to sow it with barley.
About this time occurred a strange incident. One night there was a loud crash in the yard, and the animals rushed out of their stalls. At the foot of the end wall of the big barn, where the 7 commandments were written, lay a ladder broken in 2. Squealer was sprawling beside it, and near at hand lay a lantern, a paintbrush, and an overturned pot of white paint. None of the animals could form any idea what this meant, except old Benjamin, who nodded his muzzle with a knowing air and would say nothing.
But a few days later, Muriel, reading over the 7 commandments to herself, noticed that there was yet another of them which the animals had remembered wrong.
They thought that the 5th commandment was,
No animal shall drink alcohol.
but there were 2 words they had forgotten. Actually, the commandment read,
No animal shall drink alcohol to excess.
Boxer's split hoof was a long time healing. They had started rebuilding the windmill the day after the victory celebration. Boxer refused to take even a day off, and made it a point of honor not to let it be seen that he was in pain. Clover treated the hoofs with poultices, and both she and Benjamin urged Boxer to work less hard. But he would not listen. He had one burning ambition, to see the windmill completed before he reached the age for retirement.
At the beginning, the retirement age had been fixed for horses and pigs at 12, for cows at 14, for dogs at 9, sheep at 7, for hens and geese at 5. So far, no animal had actually retired, but now that the small fields beyond the orchard had been planted in barley, it was rumored that a corner of the large pasture was to be turned into a grazing ground for superannuated animals. Boxer's 12th birthday was due in the summer of the next year.
Meanwhile, life was hard. The winter was as cold as the last one, and food was even shorter. Once again, all rations were reduced. except for those of the pigs and the dogs. Squealer explained.
We are not really short on food, comrades. In comparison with the days of Jones, the improvement is tremendous. We have more hay, more oats, more turnips. We work shorter hours. Our drinking water is of better quality. We live longer. We have more straw in our stalls and suffer less from fleas.
The animals believed every word of it. Truth be told, Jones and all that he stood for had almost faded out of their memories.
In the autumn, 4 sows all littered simultaneously, producing 31 young pigs. It was announced that a schoolroom would be built in the farmhouse garden. For the time being, the young pigs were to be given their instruction by Napoleon himself. They were discouraged from playing with the other animals. It was laid down as a rule that when a pig and any other animal met on a path, the other animal must stand aside. Also, all pigs now enjoyed the privilege of wearing green ribbons in their tails on Sundays.
The farm was still short of money. There were bricks, sand, and lime for the schoolhouse to be purchased. It was also necessary to begin saving up again for machinery for the windmill. Rations, reduced in December, were reduced again in February. Lanterns in the stalls were forbidden to save oil, but the pigs seemed comfortable enough, and in fact, were gaining weight, if anything. News leaked that every pig was now receiving a ration of a pint of beer daily, with half a gallon for Napoleon himself, which was always served to him in a crown derby tureen.
But if there were hardships to be borne, they were partly offset by the fact that life nowadays had greater dignity than ever before. There were more songs, more speeches, more processions. So what with Squealer's lists of figures and the fluttering of the flag, the animals were able to forget, at least part of the time, that their bellies were empty.
In April, Animal Farm was proclaimed a republic, and it became necessary to elect a president. There was only one candidate, Napoleon. He was elected unanimously. On the same day, it was given out that fresh documents had been discovered which revealed further details of Snowball's complicity with Jones. It now appeared that Snowball had not merely attempted to lose the Battle of the Cowshed, but had openly been fighting on Jones's side. In fact, Snowball had been the leader of the human forces, charging into battle with the cry, "Long live humanity," on his lips. The wounds on Snowball's back, which a few of the animals still remembered seeing, had been inflicted by Napoleon's teeth.
In the middle of the summer, Moses the Raven suddenly reappeared on the farm. He was quite unashamed, still did no work, and would still talk by the hour to anyone who would listen about
Sugar Candy Mountain! Oh, beautiful, glorious Sugar Candy Mountain! Up there, comrades, just on the other side of that dark and dismal cloud. That happy land where we poor animals shall rest forever from our labors. Oh, I've been there, brethren. I've seen it. The everlasting fields of clover, the linseed cake and lump sugar growing on their hedges. Oh, it's beautiful, comrades, beautiful!
Many of the animals believed him. Was it not right and just that somewhere a better world should exist? A difficult thing to comprehend was the pigs' attitude towards Moses. They declared contemptuously that his stories about Sugar Candy Mountain were lies. Yet they allowed him to remain on the farm, not working, with an allowance of a gill of beer a day.
After his hoof healed, Boxer worked harder than ever. Sometimes, the insufficient food on long hours were hard to bear, but Boxer never faltered. In nothing he said or did was there any sign that his great muscles were not what they had once been. Only his appearance seemed a little changed. His hide, less shiny than it used to be, and his great haunches seemed to have shrunken. Clover and Benjamin begged him to take care of his health, but Boxer would not listen. Sometimes, on the slope leading up to the quarry, it seemed the only thing keeping him on his feet was the will to continue.
Clover and Benjamin begged him to take care of his health.
But Boxer paid no attention.
Boxer's fallen. He's lying on his side and can't get
The animals rushed to the knoll where the windmill stood. There lay Boxer, his neck stretched out, unable to even raise his head. His eyes were glazed, his sides matted with sweat, and a thin stream of blood had trickled out of his mouth. Clover dropped to her knees beside him.
Boxer, what is it? What's wrong?
It's my lung. No matter. You'll be able to finish the windmill without me. I only had a month to go in any case. To tell you the truth, I've been looking forward to my retirement.
We must get help at once. Quick, somebody run and tell Squealer what has happened.
About a quarter of an hour later, Squealer appeared, full of sympathy and concern.
Comrade Napoleon has learned the deepest distress of this misfortune to one of our most loyal workers. He has already made arrangements to send Boxer to the town hospital for treatment.
The animals felt a little uneasy at this. They did not like to think of their sick comrade in the hands of human beings. However, Squealer convinced them that the veterinary surgeon could treat Boxer more satisfactorily than could be done on the farm. And about a half hour later, when Boxer had somewhat recovered, he managed to limp back to his stall.
I'm not too sorry about what's happened. Why, if I make a good recovery, I expect to live another 3 years. I look forward to spending the remainder of my days in the corner of the big pasture.
But Boxer, what will you ever do with your spare time?
I have a plan. Something I've long wanted to do.
What is it?
I'm going to devote the rest of my life to learning the remaining 22 letters of the alphabet.
In the middle of the day, a van came to take him away. The animals were at work when Benjamin came galloping from the direction of the farm buildings, braying at the top of his voice. It was the first time they had ever seen Benjamin excited.
Quick! Everybody come at once, they're taking Boxer away.
The animals raced back to the farm buildings.
Sure enough, there in the yard stood a large closed van with a sly-looking man in the driver's seat. The animals crowded round the van.
There he is! Inside!
He's going away! Goodbye, Boxer!
Goodbye, goodbye.
Fools! Don't you see what's written on the side of that van?
Alfred Simmons, horse slaughtering blue boiler.
Don't you understand what that means? They're selling Boxer to the knacker.
Boxer! Stop him! Somebody stop him! Come back here!
Boxer, get out! Get out quickly! They're taking you to your death!
They heard the sound of a tremendous drumming of hooves from inside the van, but the van was already gathering speed. In another moment, it disappeared down the road. Boxer was never seen again.
3 days later, it was announced that he had died in the hospital in spite of receiving every attention a horse could have. Squealer came to announce the news to the others.
I was at his bedside at the very last. At the end, almost too weak to speak, he whispered in my ear that his sole sorrow was to have passed on before the windmill was finished. Forward, comrades, he whispered. Forward in the name of rebellion. Long live Animal Farm. Long live Napoleon. These were his very last words, comrades.
The animals were enormously impressed, and when Squealer went on to give further graphic details of Boxer's deathbed, the admirable care he had received, and the expensive medicines for which Napoleon had paid without a thought as to the cost, the sorrow they felt for their comrade's death was tempered by the thought that, at least, he had died happy.
Napoleon himself appeared at the meeting in the following Sunday morning and pronounced a short oration in Boxer's honor.
We deeply regret that it was not possible to bring back our late lamented comrade's remains for internment on the farm. But in a few days, the pigs intend to hold a memorial banquet in Boxer's honor. Meanwhile, let me remind you of his priceless heritage to us. 2 maxims which every animal would do well to adopt as his own. Remember forever, comrades, the wise words of our dear Boxer. I will work harder, and Comrade Napoleon is always right.
On the day appointed for the banquet, a grocer delivered a large wooden crate to the farmhouse. That night, there was the sound of uproarious singing from within. No one stirred in the farmhouse until noon the following day. From somewhere or other, the pigs had acquired the money to buy themselves another case of whiskey.
Years passed. A time came when there was no one who remembered the old days before the rebellion, except Clover, Benjamin, Moses, and a few of the pigs.
Muriel was dead. Jones had died in an inebriate's home in another part of the country. Snowball was forgotten. Boxer was forgotten, except by the few who had loved him. Clover was an old, stout mare now, 2 years past the retiring age. But in fact, no animal had ever actually retired. Napoleon was now a mature boar of 24 stone. Squealer was so fat that he could, with difficulty, see out of his eyes. Only old Benjamin was much the same as ever, except for being a little grayer about the muzzle, and, since Boxer's death, more taciturn than ever.
Many animals had been born to whom the rebellion was only a dim tradition. The farm was more prosperous now and better organized. The windmill had been successfully completed at last, and the farm possessed a threshing machine and a hay elevator and various new buildings.
The windmill had not, after all, been used for generating electrical power. It was used for milling corn and brought in a handsome profit. But the luxuries of which Snowball had taught the animals to dream, the stalls with the electric lights and hot and cold running water, these were no longer talked about. Napoleon had denounced such ideas as being contrary to the spirit of animalism. True happiness, he said, lay in working hard and living frugally.
Somehow, it seemed the farm had grown richer without making the animals themselves any richer, except, of course, for the pigs and the dogs. It wasn't that these creatures didn't work, after their fashion. There was, as Squealer never tired of explaining, endless work in the supervision and organization of the farm.
We pigs have to expend enormous labor every day on things called files, reports, and memoranda. These are large sheets of paper which must be closely covered with writing, and as soon as they are so covered, must be burnt in the furnace. This is of the highest importance to the welfare of the farm.
As for the others, they were generally hungry. They slept on straw, they labored in the fields. In winter, they were troubled by the cold, and in summer by the flies. Sometimes the older ones among them racked their dim memories and tried to determine whether, in the early days of the rebellion, things had been better or worse, but they could not remember. Squealer's lists of figures invariably demonstrated that everything was getting better and better. Only old Benjamin professed to know that things never had been, nor ever could be, much better or much worse. Hunger, hardship, and disappointment were, he said, the unalterable law of life.
Yet, the animals never gave up hope. They were still the only farm in all England owned and operated by animals. And when they heard the gun booming and saw the flag fluttering at the masthead, their hearts swelled with pride. The talk would turn to the old heroic days, the expulsion of Jones, the writing of the 7 Commandments, the great battles in which the human invaders had been defeated. None of the old dreams had been abandoned. The republic of animals which old Major had foretold was still believed in. If they went hungry, it was not from feeding tyrannical human beings. If they worked hard, at least they worked for themselves. No creature amongst them went on 2 legs. No creature called any other creature master. All animals were equal.
One day in early summer, Squealer ordered the sheep to follow him to a piece of waste ground at the other end of the farm. There they remained for a whole week, during which time Squealer was with them for the greater part of every day, teaching them to sing a new song.
It was just after the sheep had returned on a pleasant evening, when the animals had finished work and were making their way back to the farm buildings, that a terrified neighing sounded from the yard. It was Clover! She neighed again, and all the animals rushed into the yard. Then they saw what Clover had seen.
It was Squealer, walking on his hind legs, a little awkwardly as though not quite used to supporting his considerable bulk in that position, but with perfect balance he was strolling across the yard. And a moment later, out from the farmhouse came a long file of pigs, all walking on their hind legs. One or two looked as though they would have liked the support of a stick, but with perfect balance, they were making their way round the yard.
Finally, there was a tremendous baying of dogs, and out came Napoleon himself, majestically upright, casting haughty glances from side to side with his dogs gamboling about him. And in his trotter, he carried a whip.
There was a deadly silence. Amazed, terrified, the animals watched the long line of pigs slowly march around the yard. It seemed as though the world had turned upside down. Then came a moment when, in spite of everything, in spite of their terror of the dogs and of the habit developed through long years of never complaining, never criticizing, they might have uttered some word of protest. But just at that moment, as though at a signal, the sheep burst into a tremendous plea.
4 legs good, 2 legs better. 4 legs good, 2 legs better.
It went on for 5 minutes without stopping, and by the time the sheep had quieted down, the pigs had marched back into the farmhouse.
Benjamin felt a nose nuzzling at his shoulder.
It was Clover. She tugged on his mane gently and led him to the end of the big barn where the 7 commandments were written.
My sight is failing me, but it appears that the wall looks different. Are the 7 commandments the same as they used to be, Benjamin?
For once, Benjamin consented to break his rule. He read out to her what was written on the wall. Now, there was nothing there, except for a single commandment. It read,
All animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others.
After that, it did not seem strange that the next day the pigs all carried whippets. It did not seem strange to learn that the pigs had bought themselves a wireless set, were arranging to install a telephone, and had even taken out subscriptions to the daily papers. It did not seem strange when Napoleon was seen strolling through the garden with a pipe in his mouth. No, not even when the pigs had taken Mr. Jones's clothes out of his wardrobe and put them on.
A week later, a deputation of neighboring farmers came to inspect the farm. They were shown all around and expressed great admiration for everything they saw, especially the windmill. The animals worked diligently, hardly raising their faces from the ground, not sure whether to be more afraid of the pigs or of the human visitors. That evening, loud laughter and bursts of song came from the farmhouse. At the sound of mingled voices, the animals were stricken with curiosity. What could be happening in there? Now that for the first time, animals and humans were meeting on terms of equality, they began to creep quietly into the farmhouse garden.
They tiptoed up to the farmhouse and peered through the dining room window. There, around the long table, sat half a dozen of the more eminent pigs and half a dozen farmers. Napoleon was at the head of the table, and a large jug was circulating, and the mugs were being refilled. Mr. Pilkington stood up.
Mr. Napoleon, ladies, gentlemen, it is a great source of satisfaction to me to feel that a long period of distrust and miscommunication has come to an end. There was a time when the regarded proprietors of Animal Farm were treated with a sense of misgiving by their human neighbors. It was feared that a farm owned and operated by pigs would produce an unsettling effect on the neighborhood. Too many of us assumed, I fear, that a sense of license would prevail. We feared for the effect on our own animals, but today we have inspected Animal Farm. And what did we find? Not only the most up-to-date methods, but a sense of discipline that should be an example to all farmers everywhere. I believe I'm right in saying that on this farm, the lower animals do more work and receive less food than any animals in the country.
Hear, hear.
Between human beings and pigs, there is not, nor need ever be, any clash of interest whatsoever. Our problems are the same. You have your lower animals to contend with, and we have our lower classes. So, gentlemen, a toast to the prosperity of Animal Farm.
Hey! Thank you, Mr. Pilkington, for those kind remarks. And now, our great leader Napoleon will say a few words.
Squealer, honored guests, fellow pigs. I too am happy that the period of misunderstanding has come to an end. For a long time there were rumors circulated by a foul and malignant enemy that there was something subversive, even revolutionary, in the outlook of myself and my colleagues. We have even been accused of attempting to stir up revolution on neighboring farms. Gentlemen, nothing could be farther from the truth. Our sole wish is to live at peace with everyone, and I do believe that none of the old suspicions still linger. But certain changes recently effected should have the effect of promoting confidence still further. For example, henceforth, the animals on this farm have had the rather foolish custom of addressing each other as comrade. This is to be discontinued immediately. Moreover, it gives me great pleasure to announce to you another important change. The name Animal Farm has been abolished. Henceforth, this farm shall be known by its correct and original name, the Manor Farm.
Hooray!
So, friends, I propose to you a toast. The same as before, but in a different form. Gentlemen, fill your glasses to the brim. To the prosperity of the Manor Farm.
Hey!
There was the same hearty cheering as before, and the mugs were being emptied to the dregs. But as the animals outside gazed into the scene, it seemed that some strange thing was happening. What was it that was being altered in the faces of the pigs?
Clover's old dim eyes flitted from one face to another. Some had 5 chins, some 4, some 3.
But what was it that seemed to be changing and melting? The animals outside looked from pig to man.
And from man to pig.
And from pig to man again. But already it was impossible to say which was which.